Welcome back to Mr. Vaughn's classroom, where math is made easy. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please hit the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a comment. Today we're looking at Unit 6, Introduction to Quadratic Functions, Lesson 3, Building Quadratic Functions from Geometric Patterns. The learning goal is to describe some other geometric patterns. We have 3 learning targets. Keep these in the back of your mind as we work through the practice problems. And when we get done with those, we'll come back and review these and make sure you've learned everything you need to from this lesson. The learning target number 1 says that you can recognize quadratic functions written in different ways. Learning target number 2 says that you can use information from a pattern of shapes to write a quadratic function. And learning target number 3 says that you know that in a pattern of shapes, the step number is the input and the number of squares is the output. We have one glossary term in this lesson, and that is quadratic function. A function where the output is given by a quadratic expression in the input. Simply means that where you have your input, you're going to have an expression that has a squared term, and that squared term is the highest power in the expression. Number 1, sketch or describe the figure in step 4 and step 15. So remember, we're trying to notice if there's any type of pattern that relates the step number to a square. So what I notice in step 1 is that I have 1 square by 1 square. In step 2, I have 2 squares by 2 squares with the bottom left square moved to the top right. And in step 3, I have 3 squares by 3 squares with the bottom left square moved to the top right. So if I wanted to describe step 4, I would have 4 squares wide, 4 squares tall, bottom left square moved to top right. And then if I wanted to describe step 15, this would be 15 squares wide by 15 squares tall, bottom left square moved to top right. Number 2. How many small squares will there be in each of these steps? Well, in step 4, this would be 4 times 4, which equals 16. In step 15, that would be 15 times 15, which equals 225. Number 3. Write an equation to represent the relationship between the step number n and the number of small squares y in each step. Well, y, the number of small squares, would equal the step number squared. And number 4, explain how your equation relates to the pattern. My equation shows we multiply the number of squares wide by the number of squares tall. Since these numbers are the same, we simply square the step number. If you have any questions about how to solve any part of this first practice problem, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you with any assistance I can offer. Practice problem number 2. Which expression represents the relationship between the step number n and the total number of small squares in the pattern? So this one might be easier to recognize if we start with step 3 and work backwards. Now in step 3, I want to find some way that I'm relating 3 to what I'm seeing in the pattern. And what I'm seeing is 3 squares wide by 3 squares tall, but the bottom right corner is subtracted. If I keep that pattern in mind, when I look at step 2, I see 2 squares wide by 2 squares tall with the bottom square subtracted. And in step 1, we would see 1 square wide by 1 square tall, but the square has been subtracted. So what I'm seeing is the step number is being squared and then one square is being subtracted from it. So if the step number is n, then this is n squared minus 1, and we see that right here with choice B. If you have any questions about how I solved this practice problem, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you with any answers I can provide. Our last practice problem, each figure is composed of large squares and small squares. The side length of the large square is x. Write an expression for the area of the shaded part of each figure. So in figure A, if each side is x, so from here to here is x, and from here to here is x, then when I'm finding the area, that would be x squared. But then I have these 4 white squares. And this is 1 by 1, so 1 times 1 is 1. So I have 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here. So total, I have 4. And those have been removed. So I can put minus 4. In figure B, I've got x on the side and x on the bottom. So that means I have x squared. But then I have a second big square here where I can say it's x on the side times x on the bottom. So now I have x squared for this one, and I have x squared for this one, so I have 2x squared. Then on my little squares, I have 2 times 2, which is 4, and I have 2 times 2, which is 4. So when I add those together, 4 plus 4 is 8, so I can add 8. If you have any questions about any of the practice problems from this lesson, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you with any help I can offer. Now, before we finish this lesson, let's go back and take a look at the learning targets again and make sure you've learned everything you needed to. In reviewing these learning targets, number 1 says that you can recognize quadratic functions written in different ways. So if you're comfortable recognizing them when they're drawn, if you're comfortable recognizing them when they're written as equations or expressions, then you're good on number 1. Learning target number 2 says you can use information from a pattern of shapes to write a quadratic function. So we saw patterns where squares were moved. We saw patterns where squares were subtracted. We saw patterns where squares were added. So if you felt comfortable working those practice problems, then you're right where you should be. And learning target number 3 says you know that in a pattern of shapes, the step number is the input and the number of squares is the output. And that's what we were doing on these practice problems. We were looking for a way where we could take the step number and square it, and then add or subtract anything else that we might need to in order to get the total number of squares as the output. So if you feel comfortable making all three of these statements, then you're right where you should be after this lesson. If you have any questions about these learning targets, please leave a comment below and I'll get back to you with any support I can offer. At the bottom of the screen, you should see a video that YouTube believes will be helpful for you to go watch, and you should see the subscribe button. So if you found this helpful, please hit the subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.